What would you do if the man you built an empire with threw you away for his 25-year-old secretary, took your company, and tried to make her the CEO? You don't cry. You don't beg. You buy the whole damn company out from under them. Stick around, because this story of ultimate corporate revenge involves shattered egos, a brutal boardroom ambush, and the most satisfying karma you will ever witness. The Austin skyline was a testament to ambition, and for 10 years, Jamie and Riley Montgomery had carved their own name into it. They had started OmniStack Solutions in a cramped, unair-conditioned garage off South Congress Avenue. Jamie was the brilliant, pragmatic architect of the software, a revolutionary logistics platform that caught the eye of early investors, while Riley was the charismatic salesman who could sell ice to a blizzard. Together, they were an unstoppable force. They scaled the company from 2 people eating cold ramen to a $200 million enterprise. But success has a funny way of stripping away the masks people wear. As OmniStack grew, so did the distance between them. Jamie took a step back from the limelight, exhausted from 80-hour work weeks and a grueling battle with an autoimmune flare-up that required her to rest. She trusted her husband to steer the ship. She trusted him implicitly. That was her first and perhaps most devastating mistake. Enter Cameron Reynolds. Cameron was 24, a recent graduate who had been hired initially as an intern before Riley rapidly promoted her to his executive assistant and then bafflingly to director of corporate strategy. She had no background in tech, no MBA, and a resume that consisted mostly of a brief stint at a local public relations firm. But she had something Riley at 42, and facing a midlife crisis fueled by sudden immense wealth, craved blind adoration and youth. Jamie didn't find out through a dramatic confrontation. She found out the way most modern betrayals are discovered, a notification lighting up on a locked iPad left carelessly on the kitchen island of their sprawling mansion in Tarrytown. The message displayed clearly on the lock screen read, "Thinking about what we did at the St. Regis. I need my CEO tonight." The confrontation that evening was a masterclass in gaslighting. Riley didn't apologize. Instead, he deflected blaming Jamie's health, her obsession with the back-end engineering rather than the culture of the company, and her lack of presence at high-profile networking events. "You haven't been a partner to me in years, Jamie." Riley had spat, pouring himself a glass of Macallan. Cameron understands the vision. She understands me. The divorce was a slaughter. Riley retained the services of one of the most ruthless family law attorneys in Texas, a shark who systematically dismantled Jamie's claims. Because Jamie had voluntarily stepped down from the board to focus on her health, and because Riley had spent the last 2 years quietly restructuring the company's holding entities behind her back, he held the legal high ground. He played dirty. He threatened to drag her medical records into court to prove she was unfit to manage corporate assets. He artificially deflated the company's valuation by prematurely declaring a massive loss on a risky R&D venture just weeks before the settlement. In the end, exhausted and wanting peace above all else, Jamie signed the papers. She walked away with a lump sum of $10 million, a fraction of her true equity, the house, and a clean break. Riley got OmniStack, and of course he got Cameron. As the ink dried on the final decree, Riley looked across the polished mahogany table at the mediation office. "It's for the best, Vic. You need to rest. Let the adults handle the business." Jamie didn't yell. She didn't throw her coffee in his face. She simply looked at him, her eyes as cold and deep as the Atlantic. "Take good care of my company, Riley," she whispered. He smirked, thinking she was defeated. He had no idea she was already going to war. Grief is a heavy burden, but anger is a remarkable fuel. After a month of solitary mourning and healing, Jamie Montgomery woke up one morning and decided she was done being a victim. She reached out to her old mentor, Nathaniel Hayes, a senior partner at a prominent private equity firm on Wall Street. Nathaniel had always known Jamie was the true genius behind OmniStack. Over a quiet, discreet dinner at a private club in Manhattan, Jamie laid out her plan. "Riley is a salesman, Nathaniel," she explained, tracing the rim of her wine glass. "He can pitch, but he can't operate. Without me to build the product, and with his new girlfriend whispering terrible advice in his ear, OmniStack will start hemorrhaging cash within 12 months. I want to buy it back, but I want to do it in a way he never sees coming." Nathaniel smiled, a slow, predatory grin. "A hostile takeover from the shadows. I like it." We set up a shell company, an aggressive, anonymous equity group. They formed Aegis Capital Holdings, a proxy entity registered in Delaware, layered behind so many NDAs and holding companies that tracing it back to Jamie would require a federal investigation. Meanwhile, back in Austin, Riley was fulfilling Jamie's prophecy to the letter. Intoxicated by his total control and Cameron's constant flattery, he began making catastrophic business decisions. He fired the veteran chief operating officer because Cameron found him condescending. He redirected millions from the engineering department into flashy, aggressive marketing campaigns that Cameron had designed, campaigns that looked great on Instagram, but offered zero value to their enterprise-level clients. The inevitable happened. Bugs in the software went unfixed. Server downtimes increased. Within 8 months, OmniStack lost its anchor contract with AT&T. The stock, which had been steadily climbing, began to nosedive. Panic set in among the minor shareholders and the board of directors. Riley, desperate for a cash injection to cover the mounting operational debt and to hide his gross mismanagement, began looking for private investors. He was bleeding, and there was blood in the water. This was exactly what Jamie had been waiting for. Through Aegis Capital, Nathaniel reached out to Riley. They offered a lifeline, a massive capital injection that would save OmniStack from bankruptcy. The catch: Aegis Capital required majority voting rights, a restructuring of the board, and 51% of the company's total shares. Riley backed into a corner and, terrified of losing his wealthy lifestyle, didn't look the gift horse in the mouth. He was convinced by his lawyers that Aegis was just a faceless group of New York bankers who would let him continue running the show as long as the numbers eventually improved. He was arrogant enough to believe he could outsmart them later. Over the next few weeks, behind closed doors and encrypted emails, Riley sold his soul and his company to Aegis Capital. He liquidated a massive chunk of his own personal shares to keep up the appearance of wealth to Cameron, signing away the final controlling interest. He thought he had saved his empire. He didn't realize he had just handed the keys to the castle back to its rightful queen. Jamie sat in Nathaniel's high-rise office, watching the final digital signature from Riley hit the server. The transfer was complete. She owned 51% of OmniStack Solutions. She owned the debt. She owned the board. "Well, Jamie," Nathaniel said, pouring 2 glasses of 18-year-old scotch, "you own him." "Not yet," Jamie replied softly, her eyes locked on the Austin skyline on her laptop screen. "I don't just want the company. I want him to know exactly who took it from him." It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 14 months after the divorce was finalized. The atmosphere inside OmniStack's sleek, glass-walled headquarters was electric, though for all the wrong reasons. The employees were terrified. Layoffs had been rumored for weeks, morale was at rock bottom, and the latest software patch had been a catastrophic failure. Yet on the executive floor, Riley Montgomery was acting like a king preparing for a coronation. He had called an emergency mandatory all-hands meeting in the main atrium, coupled with a formal board meeting immediately prior in the executive conference room. The agenda, according to the memo sent out the night before, was a bold new direction, for OmniStack. Riley stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his private suite, adjusting his custom Italian silk tie. Behind him, Cameron lounged on a leather sofa, sipping an espresso. She was wearing a stark white Chanel suit, her hair perfectly blown out. "You're going to be amazing, baby," Cameron cooed, checking her reflection in her phone screen. They need a fresh face, someone who understands modern brand synergy. Not those dusty old engineers. Riley smiled, his ego sufficiently stroked. His grand plan was simple, and, in his mind, brilliant. He was going to step up to the role of chairman of the board, distancing himself from the day-to-day failures of the company. And to reinvigorate the brand, he was appointing Cameron as the new chief executive officer. He assumed the faceless bankers at Aegis Capital wouldn't care who held the title as long as he assured them profits were coming. He had completely bypassed consulting them on the executive change, assuming his remaining 49% gave him the leverage to do whatever he wanted. "Let's go make history," Riley said, offering her his arm. They walked into the massive executive conference room. The heavy oak doors sealed behind them. Around the long, polished table sat the remaining original board members, older men and women who looked perpetually stressed, and a few empty chairs reserved for the representatives of their new majority shareholder, Aegis Capital, who had mysteriously declined to send names in advance. Riley took his position at the head of the table. He didn't sit. He wanted to command the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Riley began, his voice dripping with practiced corporate charm. "We are at a crossroads. OmniStack has faced challenges, yes. But with the recent capital injection from our partners at Aegis, we are primed for a renaissance." He gestured grandly to Cameron, who stood up, smiling, a practiced, camera-ready smile. "In order to navigate this new era, we need fresh leadership. Someone with an innate understanding of modern market dynamics. I am stepping into the role of chairman, and it is my absolute privilege to introduce to you the new CEO of OmniStack Solutions, Cameron Reynolds." Silence. Not a single person clapped. The veteran board members stared at Riley as if he had just lost his mind. Putting a 25-year-old with zero executive experience in charge of a sinking enterprise software company was corporate suicide. "Riley, this is highly irregular," muttered John, a board member who had been with them since year 2. "Aegis Capital has to approve a C-level shift of this magnitude. They own 51%. We haven't even met their representatives yet." Riley waved his hand dismissively. "Aegis is a silent partner, John. They trust my judgment. This is a done deal. Cameron's contract is already drafted." "Actually, Riley," a voice cut through the thick tension of the room. "Aegis Capital doesn't trust your judgment at all. In fact, we think it's fundamentally flawed." Riley froze. The blood drained from his face as he turned toward the back of the room. The heavy oak doors of the conference room had opened silently. Standing in the doorway, flanked by Nathaniel Hayes and 2 incredibly sharp-looking corporate attorneys from Kirkland and Ellis, was Jamie. She wasn't the exhausted, heartbroken woman he had bullied into submission a year ago. She was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit, her posture immaculate, her expression radiating absolute, terrifying authority. She looked like an executioner who had just arrived for her shift. "Jamie," Riley choked out, his voice cracking. What are you doing here? Security. Who let her up here?" Jamie stepped fully into the room, the heels of her Louboutins clicking methodically against the hardwood floor. It was the only sound in the room. "You can cancel security, Riley," Jamie said smoothly, walking toward the empty chair directly opposite him at the other end of the table. "They work for me now." She pulled out the chair and sat down, resting her hands on the polished wood. She looked at Riley, then shifted her gaze to Cameron, who was suddenly looking very small in her oversized white Chanel suit. Jamie offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Riley. Let me officially introduce myself. I am the sole managing director and founder of Aegis Capital Holdings, which means as of 48 hours ago, I own OmniStack." She leaned forward, the trap finally perfectly sprung. "And I have a few thoughts on your new CEO." The silence that descended upon the executive conference room was not merely the absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating physical entity. It pressed against the glass walls overlooking the Austin skyline, drained the oxygen from the meticulously climate-controlled air, and settled like a lead weight upon Riley Montgomery's chest. For a full 60 seconds, nobody moved. The veteran board members who only moments ago had been preparing to rebel against the absurd appointment of a 25-year-old CEO now sat frozen in a state of absolute bewildered paralysis. They stared at Jamie, then at Riley, and back to Jamie trying to process the seismic shift in reality that had just occurred within their corporate sanctuary. Riley's mind, usually so adept at spinning narratives and finding the slickest exit from a problem, completely stalled. He looked at the woman sitting at the opposite end of the vast mahogany table. This was not the Jamie he remembered. The woman he had discarded had been pale, exhausted by her autoimmune condition and worn down by the relentless grind of their startup years. The woman sitting before him now was a titan. Her charcoal Tom Ford suit was armor. Her posture was that of a conquering general surveying a newly captured territory. The two Kirkland and Ellis attorneys flanking her stood like sentinels, their expressions devoid of anything resembling mercy. "This is a joke," Riley finally managed to whisper, his voice thin and reedy, devoid of its usual baritone resonance. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning a stark, translucent white. "This is some kind of elaborate sick joke. Nathaniel, what the hell is this?" "You told me Aegis Capital was a syndicate out of Manhattan. You said, 'I told you exactly what you needed to hear to sign the papers, Riley.'" Nathaniel Hayes interrupted, his voice smooth and untroubled, as he withdrew a thick, leather-bound portfolio from his briefcase and placed it gently on the table. "You were hemorrhaging money, your stock was in a free fall, and you were desperate. You didn't ask questions. You just wanted the wire transfer to clear so you could keep playing pretend in this glass castle. You never once initiated due diligence on the parent entity of Aegis Capital Holdings. If you had, your lawyers might have eventually traced the LLCs back to a blind trust registered in Delaware, which is wholly owned and operated by Jamie." "That's fraud," Riley erupted, suddenly finding his voice, though it cracked with panic. He pointed a trembling finger down the length of the table. "That has to be illegal. You misrepresented the buyer. I will sue you into oblivion. I will drag this entire firm through the SEC. I'll have the Federal Trade Commission down your throats before lunchtime." Jamie didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She merely steepled her fingers and rested her chin on them, watching him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a particularly slow-witted insect thrashing in a jar. "You can certainly try, Riley," Jamie said, her tone conversational, almost polite. "But I assure you Kirkland and Ellis has spent the last 8 months ensuring every single maneuver was not only entirely legal, but completely bulletproof. We didn't defraud you. We merely offered you a rope, and you, in your infinite arrogance and desperation, decided to tie it into a noose and place it around your own neck. You sold the shares voluntarily. The signatures on the transfer documents are yours, fully notarized and filed. You took the money. You ceded 51% of the voting rights. It is entirely irrevocably done." Cameron, who had remained silent, suddenly decided that this was her moment to prove she belonged in the room. She stood up, smoothing the front of her pristine white Chanel suit, her face flushed with a mixture of indignation and embarrassment. She pointed an acrylic-tipped finger at Jamie. "Listen here." Cameron snapped, adopting the faux authoritative tone she used on the junior marketing interns. "You can't just barge in here and hijack this meeting. Riley is the chairman. I am the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of OmniStack Solutions. You might own some shares, but we run the day-to-day operations. Security should have stopped you at the lobby. I'm calling them right now." She reached for the sleek, silver conference phone sitting in the center of the table. Before her hand could even make contact with the receiver, Jamie's voice cracked through the room like a whip. "Touch that phone, Ms. Reynolds, and I will have you arrested for corporate trespassing." Cameron froze her hand, hovering an inch above the keypad. She looked at Jamie, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that you do not work here," Jamie stated calmly. She gestured to the attorney on her left, a sharp-featured man named Harrison. Harrison unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it flawlessly across the long, polished wood. It came to a stop exactly in front of Cameron. As the majority shareholder holding 51% of the voting rights, Harrison recited his voice devoid of inflection. "Aegis Capital exercises its immediate right to terminate the employment of Cameron Reynolds, effective precisely 4 minutes ago, when this meeting was called to order. Your appointment to the position of CEO was never ratified by the board, nor was it approved by the majority shareholder. You have no executive authority, no operational standing, and no legal right to be in this building. Your severance package, which is non-existent due to breach of fiduciary duty and gross incompetence, will be mailed to your permanent address." Cameron stared at the paper as if it were written in ancient Sumerian. Her mouth opened and closed silently. She looked to Riley for salvation, but Riley was currently staring at Jamie, a horrifying realization beginning to bloom in his eyes. "You manufactured the crisis," Riley whispered, the color completely draining from his face. "The stock plummeting, the sudden loss of the AT&T contract, the server downtimes. That wasn't just incompetence on our end. You engineered it." Jamie offered a small, terrifyingly cold smile. "I didn't manufacture your incompetence, Riley. You and your director of corporate strategy managed to destroy the company culture and alienate our lead developers all on your own. But the server downtimes, the massive spike in operational overhead that pushed you to the brink of bankruptcy. Yes, that was me." She leaned back in her chair, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. "Do you remember property parcel 884-B out in the Texas Hill Country?" Jamie asked. "The old decommissioned Cold War-era subterranean bunker beneath the limestone quarry I bought it 7 years ago under a shell company. I told you it was a pet project for offline data storage. You laughed at me. You told me it was a paranoid waste of capital. But when we moved the primary cooling and server arrays down there to save on Austin's exorbitant real estate and power grids, you forgot to check who actually owned the land." Riley's jaw slackened. The board members leaned in, suddenly intensely interested in the mechanics of the coup. "When you forced me out during the divorce," Jamie continued, her voice echoing off the glass walls, "you were so focused on securing the intellectual property and the OmniStack brand name that you neglected to secure the physical infrastructure leases. You assumed the company owned the bunker. It didn't. I did. And 6 months ago, when the lease came up for renewal, my holding company hiked the rent by 5,000%. You were so disconnected from the operational back end that you didn't even notice the automated payments, draining your cash reserves until the AT&T service level agreements started failing due to throttled bandwidth. I choked your servers, Riley, and you bled out without ever knowing who was holding the knife." A collective gasp rippled through the older board members. It was a masterstroke of corporate sabotage, executed with surgical precision and perfectly disguised within the labyrinthine complexities of commercial real estate law. Riley collapsed back into his chair, his breathing turning ragged. You destroyed your own creation just to get back at me." "I didn't destroy it," Jamie corrected sharply. "I pruned the rot. I excised a cancerous tumor from the executive branch, and now that I have the controlling interest back, the rent on the subterranean servers will mysteriously return to normal, the bandwidth will be unthrottled, and I will personally call the CEO of AT&T, who, by the way, has always preferred dealing with me over you to renegotiate our anchor contract. Omnistack will be fine, but you, Riley, are finished." She turned her attention to the rest of the board. "Gentlemen, ladies, let us be entirely clear about the new power structure. Aegis Capital now dictates the trajectory of this enterprise. Any board member who wishes to retain their seat will vote to immediately remove Riley Montgomery from his position as Chairman, CEO, and any other operational capacity within Omnistack Solutions. We will then vote to appoint me as the permanent, uncontested Chief Executive Officer. Do I have a motion?" "So moved," John said instantly, not missing a beat. The other board members murmured their immediate, terrified agreements. Riley looked around the room, utterly betrayed. The people who had been nodding to his every word 10 minutes ago had instantly defected to the winning side. He had nothing left. He had traded his wife, his brilliance, and ultimately his empire for the illusion of control and the fleeting validation of a younger woman. "You can't do this to me, Vic," Riley pleaded, dropping the corporate facade entirely. He looked pathetic. The sharp, charismatic salesman was gone, replaced by a terrified middle-aged man, realizing he had just lost his entire identity. "I built this with you. I sold the product. Without me, the brand is a logo." Riley, Jamie said, standing up and buttoning her jacket. "The product is the code. I am the code. You are just the packaging, and frankly, the packaging has expired." She looked at the security guards who had been standing silently outside the glass doors, having been briefed by Jamie's team hours earlier. She gave them a single sharp nod. The doors opened, and 2 massive men in dark suits stepped into the room. "Mr. Montgomery, Ms. Reynolds." The lead guard said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "It is time for you to vacate the premises. We will escort you to your vehicles. Any personal effects will be boxed and shipped to you by the end of the week." "Don't touch me!" Cameron shrieked as a guard reached out to guide her by the elbow. She grabbed her designer purse and glared at Jamie, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face. "You're a monster. You're a cold, bitter, jealous monster." Jamie didn't grace the outburst with a response. She simply watched as Cameron stormed out of the conference room, her high heels clicking frantically down the hallway. Riley, however, didn't move. He was staring down at his trembling hands. A cold sweat had broken out across his forehead, and his complexion had turned a terrifying shade of ashen grey. He placed a hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his sternum. "Riley," John asked tentatively from across the table, "are you all right?" Riley tried to speak, but only a wet, shallow gasp escaped his lips. The crushing weight that had been pressing on his chest suddenly intensified, blooming into a blinding, radiating agony that shot down his left arm and up into his jaw. The sheer, unadulterated shock of losing his company, combined with the catastrophic collapse of his ego and the immense financial ruin he now faced, had triggered a violent physiological response. His body, fueled by years of high-stress living, endless scotch, and neglected health, finally surrendered. Riley choked out his eyes, rolling back in his head. He didn't politely slump in his chair. He pitched forward with dead weight, his face smashing brutally against the polished mahogany table before his limp body slid sideways, crashing heavily to the carpeted floor. Chaos erupted. The boardroom, previously frozen in icy tension, shattered into frantic motion. John yelled for someone to call 911. Chairs were knocked over as the board members scrambled away from the fallen man. Jamie stood perfectly still at the head of the table. She looked down at the man who had betrayed her, who had stolen her life's work and handed it to a stranger. He was gasping like a fish pulled from the ocean, his face contorted in agony as his heart failed him. She felt a strange, chilling absence of emotion. She felt no pity. She felt no triumph. She only felt the cold, hard certainty of cause and effect. "Nathaniel," Jamie said, her voice cutting clearly through the panicked shouting of the board members. "Yes, Jamie," the lawyer replied, stepping back to give the security guards room to administer first aid. "Ensure the EMTs use the freight elevator when they arrive," she instructed, calmly gathering her legal binders. "I don't want the developers on the 4th floor getting distracted. We have a company to rebuild." The transition from the sterile, high-stakes environment of the corporate boardroom to the chaotic, hyper-focused reality of the emergency department was a blur of flashing lights and piercing sirens. The ambulance tore through the streets of Austin, the paramedics in the back working frantically to stabilize Riley Montgomery. The monitor above his head screamed a continuous, frantic rhythm, the green lines spiking wildly as his heart struggled to push blood through severely compromised arteries. They arrived at the trauma bay of the main acute care hospital, bursting through the double doors with the gurney. 42-year-old male, massive diaphoresis, radiating pain to the left quadrant, crushing chest pressure. The lead paramedic barked, practically running alongside the stretcher, as a swarm of nurses and residents descended upon them. EKG shows ST segment elevation in leads V 2 through V6. We have a massive anterior S, TEMI, administered aspirin nitro and a heparin bolus en route. He's hypertensive and fading fast. The triage protocols of the emergency department kicked in with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. It was a completely different kind of corporate structure, one where the currency was oxygen and blood flow, and the deadlines were measured in agonizing seconds. "Get him into Trauma 1, the attending physician shouted over the cacophony of alarms. "Page Cardiology, tell them to prep the cath lab right now. We need an emergent angiogram. Let's get 2 large-bore IVs, push fluids, and get ready to intubate if his SATs drop any further." Riley was conscious, but only barely. Through the haze of blinding pain and terrifying confusion, he looked up at the harsh fluorescent lights of the ceiling racing past him. He felt the cold snip of trauma, shears cutting through his expensive custom Italian silk tie and the fabric of his shirt. He felt the sharp sting of needles plunging into his arms and the heavy, suffocating plastic of an oxygen mask being strapped over his face. He wanted to tell them to stop. He wanted to tell them he was the chairman of OmniStack Solutions. He wanted to demand the VIP suite, but he couldn't speak. He was entirely at the mercy of strangers, stripped of his wealth, his title, and his power. Upstairs in the sterile beige purgatory of the cardiac intensive care unit's waiting room, Cameron Reynolds paced furiously. She had followed the ambulance in an Uber, arriving at the hospital, still wearing her ruined white Chanel suit. She clutched a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee, her phone pressed tightly against her ear, as she argued with Riley's personal wealth manager. "What do you mean, frozen?" Cameron hissed, keeping her voice low, so the other anxious families wouldn't hear her. "I am his fiancée. Well, practically his fiancée. We need access to the private accounts. The hospital is asking for insurance, and I don't know where his cards are." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When the wealth manager finally spoke, his voice was laced with pity and professional detachment. "Ms. Reynolds, I don't think you understand the situation," the manager explained carefully. Mr. Montgomery leveraged everything to secure the final tranche of funding from Aegis Capital. I mean everything. He put up his personal liquid assets, the Tarrytown estate, and his remaining equity as collateral against the loans to cover Omnistack's operational debt. When Aegis exercised the termination clause and seized majority control today, they called in the debts. Mr. Montgomery is personally liable for nearly $40 million in immediate corporate debt. The accounts aren't just frozen, they are currently being seized by creditors. As of 3 hours ago, Riley's net worth is effectively negative. Cameron stopped pacing. The cheap coffee cup slipped from her manicured fingers, spilling brown liquid across the institutional carpet. Negative, she repeated the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. But the house, the cars, the boat in Travis, gone, or soon to be gone, the manager confirmed bluntly. I strongly advise you to secure your own financial independence, Ms. Reynolds. Good luck. The line went dead. Cameron stood in the center of the waiting room, staring at the blank screen of her phone. A nurse in dark blue scrubs pushed through the swinging doors of the ICU, scanning the room. Family of Riley Montgomery. Cameron looked up, her heart pounding. She looked at the nurse, then down at the spilled coffee, and then out the large window facing the parking garage. The reality of the situation crashed over her with brutal clarity. Riley was no longer a tech billionaire. He was a bankrupt, broken, middle-aged man who might not even survive the night, and if he did, he would be buried beneath a mountain of insurmountable debt and legal battles. There would be no St. Regis weekends. There would be no private jets. There would only be lawyers' medical bills and a spectacular public fall from grace. "Excuse me, are you here for Riley Montgomery?" the nurse asked, again, stepping closer. Cameron swallowed hard. She adjusted the strap of her designer purse on her shoulder, lifted her chin and looked the nurse dead in the eye. "No." Cameron lied, her voice completely flat. "I must have the wrong floor." She turned on her heel and walked out of the waiting room, heading straight for the elevators. She didn't look back. By the time the elevator reached the ground floor lobby, she had already deleted Riley's number from her contacts and was drafting a message to an old boyfriend who worked in venture capital in Silicon Valley. Survival, after all, was a purely transactional game. 48 hours later, the rhythmic hiss and click of the mechanical ventilator was the only sound in ICU Room 4. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the heart monitors and the soft morning light filtering through the heavy blinds. Riley lay motionless in the center of the complex web of life support machinery. The emergency angioplasty had been successful. They had placed 3 stents in his left anterior descending artery, the Widowmaker. But the damage to the heart muscle had been severe. He was heavily sedated, intubated to assist his breathing, and tethered to a dozen bags of intravenous fluids and vasopressors to keep his blood pressure stable. The heavy door to the room opened with a soft click. Jamie stepped inside. She wasn't wearing her corporate armor today. She wore a simple, elegant trench coat over dark slacks, a pair of oversized sunglasses pushed up into her hair. She stood at the foot of the bed, her hands buried deep in her pockets, and looked at the man who had been her partner, her husband, and ultimately her greatest adversary. He looked incredibly frail. The arrogant charisma that had defined him was entirely absent, replaced by the vulnerability of a man fighting for his next breath. Jamie walked slowly around the side of the bed, stopping near the array of monitors. She watched the green line of his heartbeat, strong but artificially maintained. The nurses had told her that the sedation was being lightened, that he might be able to hear her even if he couldn't respond or open his eyes. "The surgery was a success, Riley," Jamie said softly, her voice calm and measured in the quiet room. "The doctors say you'll survive. It will be a long recovery, months of rehabilitation, a complete lifestyle change. But you will live." She paused, looking down at his pale, resting face. "I thought about not coming," she continued, her tone conversational, as if they were simply discussing quarterly projections over breakfast. "But I realized that leaving things unfinished is what got us into this mess in the first place. You always liked loose ends. I prefer clean code." She reached into the pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a small manila envelope. She placed it gently on the small rolling table next to his bed, resting it against a plastic water pitcher. "Your little girlfriend didn't stick around, by the way," Jamie informed him, feeling a tiny, undeniable spark of grim satisfaction. "She realized the money was gone before you were even out of the catheterization lab. She left you here alone. You traded everything we built for a mirage, Riley. A very expensive, very temporary mirage." Riley's hand resting on the white hospital blanket twitched slightly. The heart monitor beeped just a fraction faster. He could hear her. Through the fog of propofol and fentanyl, her words were piercing the darkness of his subconscious. "Inside that envelope," Jamie said, leaning down slightly so her voice would be clearer to him, "is a legal document drafted by Kirkland and Ellis. It's a non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement. It stipulates that you will never publicly discuss OmniStack Solutions, its internal restructuring, or my involvement in the takeover. You will walk away silently." She straightened up, her expression hardening into something resembling granite. "In exchange for your signature," she explained, "Aegis Capital will assume the $40 million of your personal debt that we triggered during the acquisition. We will unfreeze your primary checking account, which has enough to cover your immediate medical expenses, and the remaining mortgage on the Tarrytown house. You get to keep the roof over your head, and you get to avoid federal bankruptcy court. That is my final offer. It is infinitely more mercy than you showed me when you locked me out of my own life's work." A single tear slipped from the corner of Riley's closed eye, tracking slowly down his pale cheek and disappearing into the medical tape securing the breathing tube to his face. The monitor spiked again, a frantic testament to the despair raging beneath his chemically induced paralysis. He was trapped in his own ruined body, forced to listen to the absolute undeniable truth of his own destruction. "You underestimated me, Riley," Jamie whispered, stepping back from the bed and turning toward the door. "You thought because I didn't yell, because I didn't scream and break things when you left that I was weak. You forgot that I am an engineer. When an engineer encounters a critical failure in the system, they don't cry. They just quietly, methodically rewrite the code until the system does exactly what they want it to." She reached the door, grasping the heavy silver handle. She didn't look back. "Get well soon, Riley. I have a company to run." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Riley Montgomery alone, in the dark, tethered to machines with nothing but the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the crushing weight of a ruined empire to keep him company. Outside the hospital, the Austin sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass towers of the city. Jamie Montgomery hailed a black car, slid into the leatherback seat, and opened her laptop. The takeover was complete. The cleanup was finished. It was time to get back to work. 6 months passed. In the ruthless, hyper-accelerated ecosystem of the tech industry, half a year might as well have been a decade. Under Jamie's uncompromising leadership, OmniStack Solutions didn't just recover, it evolved into an absolute juggernaut. The first thing she had done was rehire the veteran engineering team Riley had alienated. She doubled their salaries, gave them equity, and moved her own office down to the development floor. She didn't want the corner suite with the panoramic view of the Colorado River. She wanted to be in the trenches, elbow deep in the raw code. The software bugs that had plagued the platform were patched within 3 weeks. A month later, Jamie personally flew to Dallas and sat in a windowless conference room with the executive board of AT&T for 9 hours. She didn't offer flashy presentations or empty marketing buzzwords. She offered them a flawless, brutally efficient logistical algorithm and a guarantee. By the time she walked out, the anchor contract was not only renewed, but expanded to cover their European operations. OmniStack's stock price didn't just rebound, it soared, breaking past its all-time high and splitting twice. Jamie was featured on the cover of Forbes with the headline, "The Architect Returns: How Jamie Montgomery Saved OmniStack from the Brink." Across town, in the cavernous, echoing halls of the Tarrytown estate, Riley's reality was a stark, agonizing contrast. The physical recovery from the massive anterior myocardial infarction was grueling. He had lost 20 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. He walked with a slight shuffling limp, relying on an aluminum cane just to get from the master bedroom to the kitchen. The vibrant, aggressive salesman who could command a room with a booming laugh and a clapped shoulder was entirely gone. In his place was a hollowed-out ghost, spending his days wrapped in a cashmere robe, staring out the massive bay windows at a swimming pool he no longer had the strength to use. He was entirely alone. The friends who had populated his lavish weekend boat parties on Lake Travis vanished the moment the news of the hostile takeover broke. The silence of the mansion was deafening, broken only by the bi-weekly visits from his physical therapist and the relentless, terrifying ring of the telephone as collection agencies circled the carcass of his finances. Jamie had kept her word. Aegis Capital had assumed the crushing $40 million corporate debt that Riley had personally guaranteed. They had unfrozen his primary checking account, leaving him with roughly $400,000, a sum that sounded substantial to a layman, but to a man with Riley's medical bills, legal retainers, and the monstrous property taxes on a Tarrytown mansion, it was an hourglass running out of sand. And the sand was about to fall much faster. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the heavy brass knocker on Riley's front door echoed through the empty house. Riley shuffled to the foyer, leaning heavily on his cane, and pulled the door open. Standing on the porch were 2 men in nondescript, cheap grey suits holding leather briefcases. They didn't look like reporters, and they certainly didn't look like friends. Riley Montgomery. The older of the two asked, flipping open a leather wallet to display a gold badge. "I'm Special Agent Miller with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. This is Agent Davis. We have a federal warrant to audit your personal financial records and the holding accounts established during the dissolution of your marriage." Riley felt the blood drain from his face, a phantom ache blooming in his chest. Audit. The divorce was finalized over a year ago. It was airtight. My lawyers. Your lawyers did a fantastic job hiding assets from your ex-wife, Mr. Montgomery. Agent Miller interrupted his tone, devoid of any warmth. Unfortunately, in your haste to deflate OmniStack's valuation and artificially suppress your own net worth to deny her equity, you utilized a series of offshore pass-through entities in the Cayman Islands. You didn't just lie to the family court judge. You lied to the federal government. You claimed a $30 million capital loss on an R&D venture that our analysts have determined never actually existed. Riley gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. He remembered the move perfectly. It was a risky strategy proposed by a sleazy offshore accountant he had met at a golf tournament. It had saved him tens of millions during the divorce settlement. "Who?" Riley's voice trembled. "Who tipped you off?" Agent Miller offered a thin, humorless smile. We received an anonymous, highly detailed dossier containing the exact routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and digital signatures linking you to the shell companies. Someone tied a perfect little bow around your financial fraud and left it on our desk. Riley closed his eyes. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Jamie. She hadn't just plotted to take the company back. She had meticulously documented every single illegal maneuver he had made to steal it from her in the first place. She had waited until he was completely stripped of his corporate protections, his expensive legal team, and his health before pulling the final pin on the grenade. "We'll need to come inside, Mr. Montgomery," Agent Davis said, stepping forward. "This is a formal seizure of documents." Riley stepped aside, defeated. He watched the agents walk into his pristine, multi-million-dollar living room, realizing with absolute certainty that he was going to lose the house. He was going to lose the remaining money in his checking account, and if the Department of Justice decided to make an example of him, he was going to lose his freedom. Desperate, terrified, and devoid of any other options, Riley picked up his phone and dialed the only man who might have a shred of insight into the nightmare swallowing him whole. Nathaniel Hayes answered on the second ring. "Riley, I was wondering when you might call." "Nathaniel, the IRS is in my house." Riley hissed, his voice cracking with panic. "Jamie sent them. She sent them the Cayman files. She's trying to put me in federal prison. Jamie didn't send them anything." "Riley," Nathaniel replied calmly, the sound of ice clinking in a glass echoing over the line. Aegis Capital's legal team discovered the discrepancies during our mandatory post-acquisition audit. As the new majority stakeholders, we have a fiduciary duty to report historical financial anomalies to the proper authorities to protect the current corporate entity from liability. We simply complied with federal law. Your mess is your own. You have to help me, Nathaniel. Please, you negotiated the takeover. Tell her to call off the dogs. I'll sign the non-disclosure agreement today. I'll sign whatever she wants. It's too late for the NDA, Riley. The offer expired. Nathaniel paused, and Riley could practically hear the shark-like grin on the lawyer's face. But since you're calling, I suppose I can clear up one final mystery for you. Have you ever wondered how Jamie managed to fund the Aegis Capital buyout? How a woman you left with a mere $10 million settlement managed to orchestrate a $200 million hostile takeover? Riley gripped the phone tightly, his breath ragged. He had wondered. It had haunted his sleepless nights. She took the $10 million. Nathaniel explained, his voice taking on a tone of genuine admiration. And she didn't put it in a mutual fund. She knew you, Riley. She knew your ego, and she knew your blind spots. She knew you were quietly dumping your own liquid capital into that disastrous crypto-logistics startup in Miami. So she took her settlement money and aggressively shorted that exact startup through a proxy hedge fund. When your little side project went bankrupt 8 months later, Jamie's position paid out at nearly 800%. She used your own money, lost by your own incompetence, to finance the war chest that bought OmniStack out from under you. The phone slipped from Riley's fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor of the foyer. The line remained open, Nathaniel's voice, a tiny metallic whisper on the ground, but Riley couldn't hear him anymore. He stared blankly at the wall, the sheer staggering magnitude of Jamie's intellect and absolute ruthlessness finally breaking his mind. She hadn't just beaten him. She had engineered a scenario where he essentially funded his own destruction. He was nothing but a pawn in a game he didn't even realize he was playing. The ballroom of the Fairmont Austin was bathed in dramatic violet and gold lighting, the air humming with the low, steady murmur of extreme wealth and influence. It was the annual Texas Technology Innovators Gala, the most exclusive event of the year, where venture capitalists, tech billionaires, and politicians gathered to network, drink expensive champagne, and celebrate the titans of their industry. Tonight, the undisputed queen of the room was Jamie Montgomery. She wore a custom-made, beautiful emerald green gown that was fiercely elegant and entirely uncompromising. She held court near the center of the room, flanked by colleagues. Across the ballroom, hovering nervously near the lavish seafood buffet, was Cameron Reynolds. Her life had not gone according to the script she had written. After abandoning Riley in the intensive care unit, she had fled to California, hoping to leverage her brief, exaggerated stint as chief executive officer into a lucrative position. But the tech world is a small, viciously gossipy village. Everyone knew exactly who she was and how she had acquired her title. Doors slammed in her face before she could even knock. Desperate to maintain her lifestyle, she had attached herself to Preston, a venture capitalist. Preston was arrogant, demanding, and saw Cameron entirely as a trophy to be displayed at events exactly like this one. He wanted a meeting with Jamie Montgomery to pitch his portfolio of artificial intelligence companies. Before Cameron could protest, Preston gripped her elbow tightly and steered her directly through the crowd, parting the sea of tech executives until they were standing mere feet away from Jamie and her inner circle. Jamie was discussing supply chain dynamics with the governor when she noticed the approaching couple. Her eyes flicked over Preston, dismissing him instantly, and landed squarely on a terrified Cameron. The corner of Jamie's mouth twitched upward into a smile so cold it could have frozen nitrogen. Preston stepped forward, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile, completely oblivious to the radioactive tension suddenly radiating between the two women. He introduced himself and Cameron, boasting about her fake executive experience in Austin. The silence that fell over Jamie's immediate circle was absolute. The lead engineers, who remembered Cameron's disastrous reign perfectly, stared at her with open contempt. Jamie took a slow sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving Cameron's trembling face, and prepared to permanently dismantle the pathetic charade right there. Jamie spoke with terrifying clarity. She publicly detailed how Cameron had played house with her husband and nearly destroyed a decade of hard work in under a year. She stated she would never trust Preston's portfolio if he took advice from a woman whose only talent was ruining marriages. Preston turned purple, realizing his networking prospects were entirely reduced to ash. He had been humiliated by the most powerful woman in the room. Cameron could not speak. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned and fled, pushing her way blindly through the massive crowd toward the nearest exit doors. Jamie watched them go, her expression impassive. She handed her empty champagne flute to a passing waiter and turned back to the governor, seamlessly picking up the conversation exactly where she had left off. The specter of her past had been confronted and permanently eradicated. Miles away in the dark, silent expanse of the Tarrytown house, Riley Montgomery sat at his kitchen island. The house was freezing because the electricity was scheduled to be shut off in the morning due to non-payment. A single camping lantern cast long, distorted shadows across the cold marble countertops of his empty, beautiful home. In front of him lay a thick stack of legal documents from the government, outlining the impending seizure of the property and the looming federal indictment for tax evasion. Beside those documents sat a tablet, the screen glowing brightly in the dark room. He was watching the live stream of the gala. He watched as Jamie took the stage to accept an award. He watched the massive crowd of thousands rise to their feet, delivering a deafening standing ovation. He saw the genuine respect and power radiating from the woman he had once dismissed as a mere basic back-end code engineer. She stepped up to the microphone. She did not thank him. She did not mention his name. She did not even hint at the immense struggle it took to reclaim her rightful throne. She simply spoke about the future, about bold innovation, and about the unbreakable resilience of a flawlessly designed system. She had entirely erased him from the narrative of her own success. Riley reached out with a trembling hand and turned off the tablet. The screen went black, plunging the cold kitchen back into the dim, lonely light of the lantern. He had truly lost everything he possessed. Karma never misses an address, especially when it's delivered by a woman who knows how to play the long game. Jamie didn't just take back her company. She took back her power, leaving Riley to face the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. If this story of ultimate corporate revenge and silent strategy had your jaw on the floor, you know exactly what to do. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant comeback, and make sure you subscribe for more incredible high-stakes drama. Until next time, remember, never underestimate the architect of your success.